As people learn about real love and as they feel real love and the, frankly, exalting changes that come with it, they tend to become excited and hopeful. In the process of growing, however, they discover that this new path is quite unfamiliar. This is going to be a very significant subject, and it's going to take quite a number of words to explain it. So relax. This new path is unfamiliar. The world does not run on unconditional love. So people tend to make a lot of mistakes in the beginning. This is not unfortunate, certainly not tragic. It's just utterly unavoidable as we learn an entirely different way of living. Often people ask why they keep making mistakes, especially the same mistakes over and over. Why, they ask. Can we not just keep moving forward in an unbroken and unbending line toward greater and greater happiness? Why can't we continuously hold on to the joy we felt in the beginning of learning about real love, where we felt understood, accepted, and loved? A multitude of answers could be offered, but the answer could be expressed in a single word: gravity. First, a brief lesson in physics. You don't need to get out your pencil and pen and learn math. In the initial formation of the universe, it is theorized that an initial explosion occurred, the Big Bang. This is not inconsistent with creation theory or anything else. It's just describing physics to you. The whole universe behaves, as we observe it, as though it started in one place and is moving out. That's how it looks. Where unfathomable quantities of matter and energy were thrown out from one place. Individual atoms were hurled into space along with larger clumps of material or mass. Mass is just another name for material or matter or stuff, as distinguished from energy. Conceptually, mass is almost the same as weight, but weight is really mass combined with gravity. That's the simplest explanation you'll ever hear. An elephant, for example, has a lot of both mass, stuff, and weight. But in space, an elephant has no weight because there's no gravity, but still has lots of mass. Now you know what mass is. Over time, often billions of years, these initial ejecting particles bumped into each other and often stuck to each other, forming increasingly large chunks of mass. You see, mass is both attracted by the gravity of other objects and also creates gravity that attracts other objects. The greater the mass of an object, the more surrounding particles and objects it attracts, which increases even more the mass of the first object, along with increasing the gravity that will attract even more mass. The more mass you get, the more mass you tend to attract. Eventually, some bodies of mass become large enough to draw large numbers of adjacent particles and objects, and then they become planets, stars, solar systems, interstellar gas clouds that are sometimes hundreds of trillions of miles across. It's incomprehensible. Galaxies. Every object that falls into a larger mass increases the mass of that object and thereby increases the gravitational pull of that object. In short, more mass means more gravity, which is why the sun, which has huge mass, has enormous gravity, or Jupiter has much more gravity than the Earth, because there's more mass. If you hold an apple in your hand, it has mass and also has, hard to believe, gravity. The apple has gravity. It exerts an effect on the tiny particles around it, but the mass is so small and the gravity is so little, you couldn't possibly notice it. If you hold a gravity in an apple in your hand, you're not in danger of cars being attracted to you and slamming into you. Now, let's look at emotional, spiritual, and intellectual gravity. This is what matters. But the principles are similar, hence the brief physics lesson. Imagine that you are standing, because you are, on a planet composed of the following. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it's an important one. So here's the planet you stand on every day. First, every experience you've ever had, every interaction you've had with another person, and every circumstance has added to the mass, the planet, of the past on which you stand. We stand on the past constantly. Every time someone is kind or unkind, every time you are taught a truth or a lie, every single experience adds to the mass of the planet you're standing on. Second component of the planet, your reactions to people and circumstances. Every time you respond with fear, anger, victimhood, or love, you add to the mass of what it will now be your past. Third, the present behaviors and circumstances you encounter. Everyone has their own pain, anger, capacity to love, and more. And these conditions in the present add to the mass of your planet. Because, of course, the instant they interact with you, it's now in the past and it's on your planetary past. Last, factors that are less obvious, like your genetic makeup, your epigenetics, your physical environment, gamma rays, chemicals in the air and water, other forms of radiation. All these things make up the planet that you stand on, which is mostly the past, but some the present. If a car is in the process of hitting you, that's part of your planet, and that's happening right now. Every experience and person and circumstance in your life contributes to the mass that affects you every minute of the day. That's why we're talking about this. This mass does several things, the planet you stand on. It tends to attract similar events and people. And in that way, it's more like a magnet, positive attracts negative consistently. It's a little different from physical mass and gravity because they don't tend to attract similar kinds of mass. Mass just attracts mass. But in emotional, spiritual, psychological settings, our planet tends to attract similar events and people. To illustrate, if you have been sufficiently victimized and taught to feel like a victim at a young age, you will tend to attract not just random experiences passing by, like gravity just randomly attracts any mass, but you will selectively attract and create more experiences that will support your basic belief in victimhood. It's a fact. You will attract people who see or feel your victimhood, who will use you, who will hurt you, who will enlist you in their victimhood, who will be victims themselves, who will victimize you. You will attract victimhood if that's the way you were raised, if that's the planet you stand on. You will see things as a victim and see injury where there is none, or you will exaggerate it when it exists. Second effect of this mass. It affects the decisions that you make every minute of the day. Well, that kind of matters then, doesn't it? And it matters that we understand it. Can't be overstated. If a man was treated with controlling criticism and anger by his mother, for example, or if a woman was treated that way by her mother or her father, I just picked a man and his mother. If he was treated with controlling criticism and anger, it is almost guaranteed that as he interacts with his wife, he will treat her as though she were his mother. That's the mass and the gravity of the planet he stands on. Most people suffer from enough PTSD that they don't even make decisions anymore. They just react to the pain of the past, to the gravity of the past, of the mass. Third, every day, the mass grows as choices, responses, and a great number of unknown factors accumulate. The more love you experience and the more you share, the more you will tend to act from a place, a mass with gravity, that generates even more love. The more you experience anger and react to anger, the more anger you will attract to the mass beneath your feet. And the more you will react to it, creating even more gravity, even more mass. To briefly illustrate, if you were raised without enough real love, which is true of, just like everybody, you carry around with you uncounted experiences that generated feelings of emptiness, fear, anger, withdrawal, on and on. With sufficient lack of love, your pain will rule your life. Notice I said just a lack of love, because that's all it takes. No overt trauma is necessary to destroy the soul of a child and then, of course, turn into an adult who's destroyed. Ruled by pain and fear, you thought you were making choices, but mostly you've just reacted to pain, which in turn caused more pain and fear and is causing more pain and fear now. And the mass gets bigger and creates gravity that becomes increasingly irresistible. See how this mass thing works? Eventually, the mass of past unloving experiences becomes the size of a large planet, the one you're standing on. And you discover you can't make choices anymore. All you do is react to the gravity. That's all you can do because it's overwhelming. The gravity of your past and present is pulling you absolutely flat to the ground where you can barely move. Jupiter has a great deal more mass than the Earth, the planet Jupiter. So on its surface, you would weigh 2.5 times what you weigh now. You'd have the same mass, but Jupiter has a much greater mass. So the effect of Jupiter's gravity on you is greater. You sometimes, I'm sure, in the morning find it difficult to haul your, make up a number, 180 pounds out of bed. Now, imagine weighing 450 pounds with the same muscle mass, which you would on Jupiter. On the surface of larger planets or stars, in fact, it's not 2.5 times, you would simply be crushed to death. Your bones would just be turned to dust. As many people are every day by the gravity of their past. I wish I were exaggerating, but I'm not. It's why people end up killing themselves. Eventually, the mass of their past becomes so large, so painful, so oppressive, it controls them and crushes them to the extent that they're making no choices at all, and they happen to also be in pain. They're miserable. Well, what choice is left? Just leave. Against the force of this increasing mass, we can struggle to get up, and we do over and over every day. Every time I work in the yard and trip and fall, I get back up. But without enough real love, the original pain and fear remain. So all we can do is add to the mass and the gravity. So what can we do? Are we doomed to die face down in the mud? Well, some people are. But no, because you're listening to this, you're not doomed. We can learn to make choices. We can learn to find the love that heals the pain and changes the gravity, changes the mass. We can learn to leave this crushing gravitational force of the past. The first step usually is to stop increasing the gravity of the planet we're on. Quit adding to the mass. Quit making it worse. We have to stop adding to the mass of the planet that's trapping us. Now, how does that translate into our everyday lives? It's easy to say, stop making the mass bigger. How? Here's one example. People. There are people who whine, manipulate, get angry, control. That's all they do all day long. And each time they add to the mass and to the soul-sucking gravity of their planet and ours. We have to avoid such people where possible, just as you would avoid somebody who had a communicable disease, which we all happen to be doing right now, because there's a pandemic on the planet. You wouldn't knowingly expose yourself to somebody who had coronavirus, and yet every day we knowingly expose ourselves, often excusing it by saying, well, but they're our family. We knowingly expose ourselves to people who are adding to a mass that is crushing us. See how that doesn't make sense? Well, but what if they're family members, people say, as they often are? All the more reason to avoid them, because they constantly add to a mass that they helped create in the first place. In most cases, we're standing on a mass that was mostly created by our families. Another thing, influences. We've all acquired behaviors or habits that simply alleviate temporarily the pain in our lives. Video games, Facebook, political talk shows, activism, YouTube, alcohol, porn, anger, the list is endless. We simply can't afford the mass and gravity that they bring into our lives. It's not good gravity. Many of these influences are actually serious addictions. Sometimes we have to stop them before we can make any changes. Sometimes, though, we have to make genuine changes, like getting loved, before we can stop our addiction. So sometimes we have to do both at the same time, stop our addictions and be finding love at the same time. The effect is synergistic. Now, the second way to diminish the gravity that would keep us bound to the past as surely as chains or prison bars. Escape. It's not enough simply to fight something, in this case, gravity or prison bars. We have to set our sights much higher than that. If we're not happy, peaceful, and loving, we want to escape our present planet's gravity, because it's unhappy, entirely. We want to genuinely live, not just spend a lifetime slogging through the mud as the gravity keeps dragging us beneath the surface. That's not living, and it's not living emotionally speaking. You wouldn't put up with an environment like that physically speaking, slogging through the mud and drowning every other day, but we do it emotionally. So we need to identify a higher plane of living and move toward it, not just away from the old gravity and mere survival, because the gravity never stops. Gravity never sleeps. So how do we do that? Move toward what? I'm going to name just a few things we can move toward. There are many. We can move toward the love of another person, someone who genuinely sees and loves us, a wise person, or toward multiple people like that. We can move toward the love of God, the ultimate wise person. We can move toward being loving toward others, toward being responsible for our own choices, never blaming people or things for our condition. We can move toward happiness, which is a natural result of all the goals I just described, the things that we would move toward. That if you move toward love and loving and responsible, you're going to be happy. In the process of escaping the gravity of a lifetime of experiences, we can't even contemplate being half committed. Can't. Halfway isn't enough to overcome gravity of this magnitude, just like it's not enough to overcome the gravity of the earth. We have to generate enough thrust away from the surface, just like a rocket does, to escape the gravity and achieve orbit around the mass, where we become weightless in the space above it, separated from it, unaffected by its gravity. When you see astronauts do spacewalks, they're unaffected by gravity. The gravity's still there, but they're in an orbital velocity, so it doesn't affect them anymore. The physics of all that is a little more complicated, but we don't care. You can just see them on a spacewalk and you can see the effects. Simply making half-hearted leaps into the air is ridiculous. Can you imagine somebody just jumping up and down on the ground and you ask them what they're doing and they're saying, if I jump enough times, I'll get into orbit? Because all you do is fall back to the ground, often injured and adding to the mass. Back to physical gravity for a moment. If a rocket shoots into the air, and they make such rockets, and rises to a height of 60 miles from the mass, which is exactly what some commercial rockets have done for their high-paying customers. They take them to a height of 60 miles so that they can see the Earth from an entirely different perspective, and people come back and go, wow, that was so cool. Kind of like bungee jumping, but on a cosmic scale. They're thrilled with the acceleration, the excitement of being in the rocket ship. The view is spectacular, 60 miles up. I mean, that is so much higher than an airliner. It's a unique experience, and they'll pay a lot for it. But then the vehicle must return to the earth from which it came, because gravity pulls it back down. Always does. Never sleeps. It was fun, but nothing fundamental has changed. You're still rooted to gravity. Just as emotionally speaking, we all tend to stay rooted to the same spot till we're dead. In order to rise to just 100 miles above the earth, that's not that much further than the 60-mile little description I just gave. We go up 60 miles and just drop right back down. If you can get up to 100 miles and achieve a condition of enough, not just height, but velocity, where you get into an orbit around the earth, the difference between rising 60 miles and getting into orbit at only 100 miles is 32 times the energy. Yeah, 32 times. Not 50% more. 32 times consumed by the suborbital flight. Big difference, which is why orbital rockets that you see on television look the size of large buildings. This is very similar to the changes required to leave our emotional past behind. That's why I'm talking about this physics, because they're so similar and it's so visible in physics. If we don't go, emotionally speaking, all the way to achieve orbit, then all we do is just keep jumping up and down and going nowhere. We might even get to 60 miles high, 60 miles from the mass of our emotional planetary gravity. But we're going to fall back down. We will. The gravity guarantees it. It's not a guess. It will. But if we consistently seek the love that we need, and if we're willing to leave behind our excuses, our justifications, our denial, our distrust, our addictions, the list is endless, we can achieve orbit and freedom. And when it comes, but here's the cool thing, when it comes to emotional orbit, it does not require 32 times the effort of just jumping halfway up away from the mass over and over, which produces no results at all. In fact, the effort of slogging through the mud while being sucked down by emotional gravity is soul destroying. That is the biggest effort, not being in orbit. And it produces no good result. I would say it qualifies as the dumb way to live. So let's say that you find the real love you need. You believe it, you trust it, you embrace it, you luxuriate in it, you share it with others, you learn to be responsible, and you achieve genuine happiness. Well, guess what? You just did that step by step. That didn't sound so very difficult. It's easier than slogging through the mud. Now you're in what's called low Earth orbit. Cool. But don't be satisfied even with that. Orbits eventually decay. That's why satellites fall to the Earth after, 2 years to hundreds of years. Orbits become lower with insufficient velocity, for example. If you're in low Earth orbit, every time you hit a single molecule of oxygen, nitrogen, anything in the straying from the upper atmosphere, it slows you down a little bit. A little, but thousands of a little makes a lot. And then eventually your orbit decays and boom, and then there's the influence of the moon and other stars and blah, blah, blah. Orbits decay. With very little effort, however, compared to achieving orbit in the first place. An object already in orbit can rise to a slightly higher orbit. Not much effort. And then it's much less likely to fall to the ground. Our GPS satellites, for example, are in a much higher orbit than, say, the space station. And it's much less likely to fall to the ground because it's higher, it's going faster, and even less likely if the mass is large. The moon, for example, is in a higher orbit, a lot higher, 250 million miles above the Earth. And its mass and velocity make it unlikely to fall to the Earth for, they estimate, well, billions of years. So you can pretty much count on it being there tomorrow. Same with the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Higher orbit, big velocity, big mass. Every time we make a right choice, we choose to feel loved, we choose to be loving, we choose to be responsible and happy, we add mass and velocity to the growing moon that we're creating. The moon that's orbiting the Earth, the moon that has risen above the past. You want to be a moon. You don't want to crash to the Earth. We rise above the PCSD that was killing us. If we keep going, we become a planet, even bigger than the one we left. And we achieve an orbit so high that we're not tied to the old planet anymore. We're not tied to the past. That's wow. We can establish our own orbit around a different center, like, the sun, where orbits are measured in billions of years. Doesn't that sound more attractive than rising up out of the mud and falling right back into it? And we won't be alone. Space can be lonely if you're the only one out there. No, we can be with others who have accomplished the same. We can invite others to come with us. In fact, if our mass becomes large enough, we can actually attract people to become with us. Our gravity can become an incredibly positive thing. So what am I saying? It wasn't about physics. Don't quit. Don't do half measures. Make whatever effort is required, whatever sacrifices, so you can escape the gravity of the past. Find every morsel of love you can. Be grateful for it instead of forgetting, as we usually do. Make choices instead of reacting to diminished pain. Surround yourself with loving people. Share the love you have. Keep making the right choices, happy choices, and one day you'll discover bit by bit, shovel by shovel, molecule by molecule, that you've become a planet orbiting the sun instead of slogging through the mud on the old planet, exhausted and hopeless. Well, that sounds pretty good. The power of genuine happiness is indescribable. It's worth everything we have to reach it, individually, in relationships, and as parents. And as parents, we can teach our children how to do the same, how to create their own planet, where they don't have to slog through the mud and drown in it. Keep going. We cannot know what it's like to reach orbit and establish our own gravity until we're there. You jump halfway up, you have no idea what your own orbit is like. None. But we can do it. To those of you who are already learning how to love and teach, I bow my head, I'm not kidding, in acknowledgement of your heroism. To those of you who have not yet learned about unconditional love, I promise you that it's worth the effort. We all have the opportunity to be involved in this changing of lives, changing of orbits, beginning with our own.